for those who haven't met David, this is a person who's been in the profession a very long time, and he's taught at every level, supervised, taught in college, edited school arts, served as president of the NAEA. He's now officially retired and writing a book very much on the issues that are concern us. And philosophically, we share the notion of a learner-centered practice that is rich in studio experiences for students. So with that little bit of an introduction, David, I would like you to talk this morning a little bit about the man you discovered while you were doing your doctoral work yourself, Rousseau, and the little book he wrote called Emile. And we'd like to know the story of Emile and then Sophie. So if you would just sort of give us that background.
My interest in Rousseau is consistent with a practice that I think is important for any professional to engage in, and that's a constant sort of review of themselves. The idea of questioning yourself and being very self-critical. As an aspect of that process sort of led me to the question of, why do I think the way I do about the way I teach and the way I function in the classroom, beliefs, values, and so on. And in during my doctoral studies, I had an opportunity, of course, to take a year or better off and follow that kind of inquiry. It led backwards as I started looking Lowenfeld, yeah, then going to Dewey, yeah, okay, and then, well, that sort of led to Froebel, and Froebel led to Pestalozzi, and pretty soon I ended up with Emile. And it appeared to me that that was sort of a benchmark where we had a fundamental transition in the way people thought about themselves generally, but in an influence that altered the course of educational practice and is still impacting on it in a way that very few people really appreciate. Rousseau was born and grew and practiced at the height of I guess what was called the Age of Reason, the 1700s, where there was great excitement about the capacity of people to logically follow a pattern of thought, reach conclusions. The whole idea of the scientific methodology was beginning to emerge. And the philosophers of that time were pretty much invested in reflections upon the capacity of man in their reasoning functions. Rousseau sort of threw a grenade in the middle of all of that. In the late 1700s, he began questioning the route of pure reason and began reflecting upon another aspect of the human condition, and that was the emotional side. And in doing so, he did as thinkers did at that time, wrote essays, had these essays published, and emerged as one of the major essayists, philosophers of his era. We're talking again about the late 1700s. A couple of things just to give him a little bit of context. He wrote a tract called The Social Contract, which was the argument for an approach to government where the governed determined who would lead them and what laws were appropriate for their well-being. And this social contract was electrified Europe in terms of its implications, and it's considered one of the bodies of thought that helped trigger the French Revolution. So Rousseau was seen as a controversial figure from the get-go. He was born, raised in Switzerland, and part of that kind of outsider mentality led him to other questions regarding the human condition. And he was at some point asked to reflect upon a way of educating a child. People at this time, such as Rousseau, of course, were dependent upon patrons, and one of his patrons wanted him to advise her on the raising of their child, and that led Emile into reflections upon the nature of children, which was quite remarkable at a time to where children weren't really given much thought until they had reached their majority, being the fact that very few children, given the number of births, live beyond about 7, 8 years of age. So at Rousseau's time, our idea of the child was totally inconsistent with what existed at that time. Children were simply there. They weren't thought about. They weren't given any attention until they were old enough to, if you will, reason. And Rousseau, in his reflections, started looking at the child and came out with a book or a essay that dealt with the education, the rearing of a child. And he took an interesting tract on this and did it in kind of a novelized form, which made it especially attractive to readers. And and he sort of embodied his thought in reflections upon how to raise a prototypical child, which he named Emile. And the text or the book that was written is really a story about how Emile should be raised. And it's a pastiche of philosophy, it's a pastiche of educational theory. It's hard to sort of categorize exactly what kind of a book it is, other than the fact that it had a novel, if you will, quality to it that made it extremely attractive to a broad band of readers. Also, it was so attractive that it was banned in many countries because of it was controversial. Many of the aristocracy, the royalty, saw it as an assault upon their prerogatives, their imperatives, and banned the book, which it's the first educational book I know of to be banned. But in any case, Rousseau talked about the appropriate way to raise a child and how a child learned. And that, of course, is the story of Emile. We don't have time to go into it. You could make a semester course out of this and just get through, the book itself, let alone his secondary writings, such as the one on Eloise and some of the other essays that sort of put this book in context. One of the interesting things about Rousseau's writing is that any one of his books or essays or tracts can be taken in whole of themselves. They're complete in and of themselves. And yet, as you read the larger body of his work, there's a coherency, the way they connect. So it's rather interesting. You can read the book, and that in and of itself is adequate in terms of a kind of knowing that is valuable. If you wanted to read The Social Contract, you would begin to see how that connects with ideas related to the rearing of a child. If you wanted to read his letters to Sophie, why, that would also speak to the challenge that he received after Emile was written. Well, what about raising a young woman? And the whole of his body of work can be taken, as I say, as a kind of a gestalt that is quite easy to deal with. Anyway, I found him fascinating. So enough for context. The book essentially deals with some revolutionary ideas. He takes the notion that, in the first place, the child is a viable entity and one that merits close and careful attention, that they're unique individuals and they have qualities distinct unto themselves. And prior to Rousseau's declarations, again, the general reflections saw the child as simply a mini adult. That was how they were treated. That was how they were handled, and it was a pretty grim kind of interaction, except for maybe for the natural instincts that would come into play in the intimacy of a family. But in the main, children were seen as mini adults, and they really weren't given much attention nor valued much until they had reached a size that they could contribute to the welfare of their family group and to the community. So in discussing Emile, Rousseau sort of speaks to the how the child grew. I would say the passages that they made as they went from birth to young adulthood. And again, this was extraordinarily unique, quite revolutionary, and it resonated. You know, every now and then there's a message that comes along that just has sort of a visceral rightness to it that is embraced and affects the way multitudes think about themselves and about others. So this was one of those kind of books. And the essence of it was, again, he talks about how Emile develops and what's necessary. And he had a couple of fundamental premises he worked with. One is he felt that we're born as savages, we're born into a savage state, and we have to learn or in our growing have to acquire the capacity to function in a social context. So we move from the savage to the civilized, I guess, is one way you might want to put it. So Rousseau speaks about, as they say, the infant, the young savage, and how we're going to tame this critter. Anybody that's raised a kid is very sympathetic to that concept. So the issue that, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but in any case, he starts out, again, dealing with the idea that the child is born as a sensate entity, and exists in two essential states. One is an emotional, there's sort of an emotional state in which the individual resides, and there is the other one that emerges with the passage of time and with growth and with the accumulation of experience, and that's the intellect. So he's the first to really deal with the emotional aspect of the human equation in a forthright way, and particularly placing it in a kind of a educational context, in a manner that it can be sort of addressed and manipulated or altered or shaped, if you will, by outside influences. He goes through, he's the first one to really speak of the idea of discernible passages that the human entity moves through from infancy to adulthood. One starts out, of course, as an infant. There is particular attributes that are consistent with infancy. And he discusses these. And I'm not going to get into this. We just don't have time. And that's something for other discussions. But I just want to sort of list these. And they're sort of self-explanatory almost by the way he speaks to them. But he speaks of the infant. Then he talks about boyhood. I always am reminded about how things have changed, because every time I've dealt with Emile in classes over the last 20 years, there's always somebody that raises their hand objecting terribly to the fact that he talked about boyhood and not girlhood or childhood or so on. And you have to remember is that this guy is consistent with his time. If children weren't viable entities till they grew up, seems like the young ladies were or girls were even less so. So the reality of it is that when he talks about boyhood, he's talking about a particular time for all children, though he doesn't know it, I don't think. But he speaks of boyhood, and then one moves from this period into a kind of an age of reason. The child becomes a reasoning entity, and with that capacity, they have then the wherewithal to acquire, if you will, social status. They become then socialized, or they move into a social posture that gives them full membership in their community, whatever that might be. So he sort of deals with four principal stages: infancy, boyhood, reason, and the social issue. So with that, and then he describes what each of those deal with, he gives a sort of a map or a roadmap on how one might set up a way to teach the very young. And this is, again, very revolutionary, very enlightening, and it drew advocates very quickly to the idea. So it's one of those things where it didn't take several hundred years for an idea to move into the mainstream. Within 100 years or so, this notion of the child as a distinct and unique entity having characteristics that are peculiar to itself becomes sort of the bedrock of the more cutting-edge educational theory. It grounded Pestalozzi. We know for a fact that Pestalozzi drew his inspiration from Emile. Froebel acknowledges Emile, and these are some of the great educationists that come along in the 1800s. And in the United States, there is evidence that Emile was one of the few books that were in the early libraries of the founders of this country, Jefferson and people of this sort. Keep in mind that books were rare and very few, and when one of them happened to be common in the libraries of a number of people, that gave it a particular status, and it suggests a particular importance to it. So even our founding fathers were familiar with Rousseau's works and points of view. Maybe that has something to do with where we are today, good perhaps and even bad. But nevertheless, this idea of stage theory sort of is rooted in Emile. I have no evidence, and no one's brought any forward, that this idea of stage development, was thought of or spoken of prior to Rousseau. So it's a very distinct turning point, one of those rare instances to where it's very clear that here's a point in time where something profound occurred, and we're still struggling with the implications of the child and learning more and more about it. Most of the 1800s, the methodology that was put forward during the 1800s, where we moved from a kind of a reasoned approach where the idea was to pour in adult knowledge into this empty vessel called the child, to an acceptance of the child as a full entity in and of itself that needed nourishment for its internal expansion, which really caught hold in the early part of this century. But this, all through the 1800s, this idea was of the developing child was churning in the leading educationists. And it was particularly embraced in England, the North European countries, and again came here rather quickly. And there's ample evidence, as I say, that the early leadership, both in government and in education, were aware of Emile. He wasn't particularly favored by the ministry because he challenged ideas that were part of religious dogma. I want to read you just the opening, and it speaks volumes in itself. The very opening line in his text. Everything is good as it comes from the hands of the Creator. Everything degenerates in the hands of man. Bingo. Now his task, and the task that parents have, who he was speaking to, is to somehow or another limit that degeneration. And that, of course, is the task of education, to sort of maintain, if you will, the nobility that is the province of the grand creator. So there's a lot of interesting sort of philosophic sets throughout the text. Okay, so we have infancy, boyhood, the reason, and the social stage. That carried into this century. It was picked up by contemporary educationists, and it was particularly attractive to a new republic called America, where we were sort of just having to invent a whole new way of dealing with the human condition. It's one thing to free politically a population, but where do you go from there? And with the industrialization of a country requiring a certain sort of intellectual capacity in its citizenry for economic and political purposes, comes the issue of behavior, and comes the issue of one's emotional sets. We don't want the child to remain a savage, and yet by the same token, we don't want them to degenerate into some sort of a non-functional entity. So you have this stage theory that is evolving during the 1800s and hits its stride really with Dewey as we enter the 20th century. Isn't that right? We're in the 21st now, I'm thinking, okay. So the story, I guess, of education is you know, the discovery of the child, and then the century of doing that. The other one is, what do you do with it once you've discovered it? And that was the task of the last century, and I don't think we're finished with that yet. We've got probably another century or two to go before we sort that one out. Right now, you're all inheritors of ideas that were set loose by his thinking and interpretations of it. It's been distilled over the decades, over a couple centuries, certainly. And we have, as we've looked more closely at the child, we discover more and more and more and more and more that verifies, if you will, if nothing more, the correctness of the instincts of this genius. And in some ways, he sort of gave us a structure from which we can move from as well as move to, in terms of theory, in terms of practice, in terms of philosophy, and particularly as it relates to the business we're in, and that is the nourishment of learners, children. So I guess with that, I'm going to quit. Take questions.
Well, I'm not going to let you quit right there, because now I want you to flash forward
All right.
to the 21st century.
You're
And
going to force it, aren't you?
yes, I am. I know that you have been thinking about the significance of developmental theory today,
Yes.
as it informs what we do in the classroom as art teachers.
Okay.
Would you care to share a thought or two?
All right. So, it happened here, Karen. fellow named Victor Lowenfeld did a major upgrade on Rousseau, though he doesn't declare that in his work. But in the late 40s and early 50s, Victor Lowenfeld sort of updated developmental theory, at least as it affects us, art educators. And Lowenfeld put forward, it was almost a paraphrasing of Emile, particularly in terms of this stage concept. And Lowenfeld argued that indeed the child moved through several stages in the text creative growth and development. And where you have this sort of passage with Emile, Lowenfeld focused it in terms of the creative aspects of the human condition, and he argued that this was made manifest in the images and structures that children produced, compulsively as a result of being who they were. And we find the update, we're talking mid-50s, of developmentalism, and we say that, and you're all familiar with this, the child went through the scribbling stage, then it was the pre-schematic, the and these were the stages, the discernible stages, or the discernible sort of passages that all of us made as we struggled to move from infancy to adulthood. Now, Lowenfeld drew upon his background as a European intellectual or a European educationist. He was trained in Northern Europe as a psychologist, educator, and familiar with contemporary theories that Rousseau had influenced. And so we're not surprised that that translated this way once he had come to this country, right prior to World War II. Now, what has occurred is that this is the sort of historic breakdown, I guess, or description of these passages. You still use it here, do you not? Yeah, you think in terms, well, the child scribbles, and then they sort of do funny little critters, and then they do pretty well resolved drawings, and then they really struggle to make it look real, then they get it more real, and so on, right? We see that occur on their paper. There's a lot that's happened in 50 years. Now, from the late 50s up until the current day, there's been quantum leaps in terms of inquiry into the nature of the child. By psychologists, by educationists, by people that are simply interested in them. And with art educators, something curious occurs in the, what is it? Barkin was what, about 70, late 60s? When did he come into play, Al? Manuel Barkin.
Oh, the,
Early 60s. After this came out, of course, you had academics that were going to scrutinize it, and it was challenged. One of the more powerful challenges came from a man called Emmanuel Barkin. And Barkin argued that art education shouldn't be warm and fuzzy. It should be dealing with content, that there is a content called art, and we need to make sure that that content is taught. And of course, this resonated. We were terrified of the fact that the Sputnik was Russian rather than America, and everything sort of flipped in terms of educational practice. No more warm fuzzy. Let's make these kids learn it so we can put a rocket in space ourselves. And your parents lived through that, and it was sort of a schizophrenic time. And we're still dealing with the sort of debris of that time. So following this came a kind of a content advocacy that is still very strongly in play. And we have now a kind of a schizophrenia in our field where we have practitioners working with children that have this sort of inherent sense of their uniqueness, their inherent sense of need that goes beyond just content. They see them functioning in ways that isn't necessarily explained by explicit conventional, by the conventions of creating a picture. That isn't explained by color theory. It isn't explained by the deconstruction of a masterwork. It isn't explained by content. And so you've got that going on the line, and then in academia you have a growing sort of frenzy about the correct content. What should we, if you will, pour into this vessel that's out there? And what is sort of fascinating is that general educationists are rediscovering the child and becoming more and more concerned with developmental issues, as art educators are abandoning the child and becoming more and more concerned with content issues. I mean, you talk about nutsiness. We were on target all through the first half of this century in terms of our advocacy. We were the main advocacy in the schools for the child, believe it or not. Had tremendous influence, particularly in those years between World War I and World War II, and immediately after World War II. But again, this occurred, and we're really in a topsy-turvy state. Anyhow, in my own reflections, I'm struggling with a conflict I live with also, that there is a content that is valuable and that I believe is necessary and absolutely essential to the enculturation process of a population. All right? We can't ignore that. We have to pay attention to, if you will, those sort of compositional conventions that make possible a coherent way of seeing phenomena and dealing with it, in terms of meaning, in terms of its impact. We need to understand that. We need to understand, if you will, what motivates particular ideas of people who speak to us in universal ways, and that's visually. I could go on and on and on with the importance of content, but we can't lose the child in this. That's where it begins, and we have to constantly fit content to the vessel rather than try to shape the vessel to the content. That's my argument. So in pondering this, I'm looking upon the fact that across our field there has been a general assault on this developmental theory. as being out of date, having little or no use, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. While everything around us is given more and more evidence to the rightness of what Rousseau was understanding, you know, in his own way over 200 years ago. Curious, right? So, anyhow, having to deal with that, I'm sort of playing, and I've been playing with, if you will, a way of sort of getting a handle conceptually upon what's going on with the child. And right now, this is what I've come to, is that we start out as sensory entities. All right? As we accumulate and acquire data through our senses, we begin to struggle with forming and shaping that. And this is pretty well backed up by contemporary psychologists. And children, if you notice, as they start speaking, as they start moving out of the crib, so to speak, they struggle with what's about them, with bits and pieces that aren't quite coherent yet. And I argue that this is somewhat pre-iconic, is that we begin dealing with bits and pieces of phenomena that are formed, that are known, that are given to us, that represent, if you will, aspects of the environment in which we live. They're those icons that sort of mark places. All right? As we accumulate those, we begin replicating them, we begin mastering them, we begin organizing them. In other words, we begin bringing them under control. And once that occurs, we shape them into narratives. If there's anything we know, that children don't make pictures for artistic purposes, they make pictures to say something. Always. No exception. All right? And as they acquire narrative skill, the capacity to manipulate those icons that they have identified, that they've accumulated, that they've helped shape, as that occurs, they move them into narratives. And as they master the narrative, as they become increasingly secure in their narrative skill, then they begin dealing with aesthetic issues. They begin embellishing. They begin giving them personal signatures. They become increasingly intrigued with the unique, not only in their own work, but in others' work. Okay? Now, it's at this point that we move into, if you will, the arts. So this, I argue, may be a better way of understanding how the child moves into adulthood. And with the passage, into the aesthetic, where we've arrived. From then on, it's simply increasing capacity, increasing skill. And usually it's at about the junior high level that we arrive at, or the middle school level. I'm really showing my age here. It's at that shift from narrative to the embellishment of the narrative, and qualifying it in unique personal ways, and reveling in that sort of elevated aspect of correspondence, that we move into a time that consumes us for the rest of our lives. All right? Does that do?